I think we've got a theme which opens us up to get a lot of really interesting and diverse perspectives. And we have a panel that can, I think, greatly add to that diversity. To my left is Philippe Alfonso. He's the Political Secretary of the European Transport Workers Federation, ETF. Then we have Christoph Titgat, Secretary General, Sea Europe, which is the European Shipbuilders and Maritime Equipment Manufacturers. We have Martin Dorsman, the European Ship Owners Association, and Catherine Bamford, who's Director of Trade and Development at the Port of Vancouver in Canada. As you see, immediately to my left, we have someone representing European transport workers, and in this case we're looking at seafarers, someone on the shipbuilding perspective, and someone from the ship owning perspective, and then we have the port and trade perspective from Catherine. This gives us a pretty wide angle on what are the questions. So I'm going to begin by asking everyone in a way the same question to set the field for us. Philippe, picking, all these things are a bit random, looking back 10 years, what have been the key things about workers that you represent in this industry that you would like to remark? And looking forward 5 or 10 years, what are the key things you would like to see as public policy objectives?
Thank you for the question and for the kind invitation to take part in this very interesting gathering. Well, I should say that I've been witnessing the latest development over the past decades, and I would say that for the seafarers I'm very proud to represent, about 270,000 seafarers, be they ratings and officers. The most important question is safeguarding the employment for those people. And the question was already there 10 years ago. It's still there. We are competing with third country nationals. The numbers of seafarers have been shrinking over the years, so I should rather say the share of European or domestic seafarers in Europe have been shrinking compared to an increase of seafarers coming from third country nationals.
What are those numbers, forgive my interruption, shrinking from what to what? What kind of order of magnitude?
And that's the very interesting question you are making, because we are lacking a lot of data and harmonized information about the numbers of seafarers. What I can say is that our members are reporting a lot of people losing their job or not being employed. So there is a huge demand, there is a huge problem of demand for European seafarers. It's not so much a question of supply. I would say there is still plenty of opportunities for European seafarers and people interested to get a certification of competency, consider a career at sea. The problem is rather a question of demand due to the fact that they are competing on no equal footing. But the question of statistics is key. We are just embarking with the EXA and with Martin Dorsman here in a very interesting project, youth-funded project on mapping the seafaring workforce in Europe, because simply we just rely on very patchy information coming from the BIMCO report, the jury studies. Recently there was a very interesting report by the EMSA, the European Maritime Safety Agency, but still the information collected is not collected in a uniform way from one member state to another, so we still need to have a clear picture. But I can tell you that from the information I receive from my members, we are losing European seafarers, and we do need, I believe, to find ways of stimulating the demand for European seafarers, and I think maritime subsidies can make a huge difference in that regard.
Well, let me ask you then, if there was, whatever it all is, a business as usual process, so that not much changed, what would you expect to happen over the coming years? That declining number you suggest would continue to decline in terms of EU-based seafarers?
Yeah, probably the share of European seafarers will continue declining, and so will be the other professions, shore-based positions, because we should never forget one very important element. The seafaring expertise has to be valued in shore-based activities afterwards. To dynamize the maritime clusters, we need to rely on the expertise of those who have been embarking part of their career at sea, and who have been developing an expertise that could be really valued. And we need to, in order to make the profession more attractive, I should say, we need to provide youngsters, women seafarers, European seafarers, with the prospect of having a kind of second life after having being active in a career at sea, in order to stimulate further the attractiveness of the sector. But my prediction will be quite gloomy, I'm afraid. And we really need to make the most for safeguarding the critical mass of European seafarers or domestic seafarers, call them.
So let me ask you on I mean, thank you for your frankness. If you say it's gloomy, you're kind of figuring there is a trend and it's likely to deepen. So there are two kind of big options if we're at that junction. One is just kind of travel down the road. It's life, it's where the world is bringing us. Or the other is to seek to, if not reverse trend, at least slow trend. What should policymakers do, if anything, in your view, to do with the question you've just raised?
Well, part of this, the interest of this session was to talk about, address the issue of maritime subsidies.
Okay, off you go.
And I think this is where there is room for doing something at European level. We are all competing in a very difficult environment. The competition is fierce, globally, internationally. I should remind also something important. The major distortion of the market comes from the fact that we have the flags of convenience or open registries. And this might be the elephant in the room, but if we cannot name this system, which had far-reaching implication on the shrinking precisely of EU domiciled seafarers against other categories of workers, then we are missing something. So actually the very unfair competition environment which has been created by the FOC system obliges in a way to have maritime subsidies very operative and very efficient. And for the time being, to answer your question, I would say that there is a lot of room for improvement. We need to have those maritime subsidies and any tax incentives or tax reliefs very much connected with some conditions attached to the training and the employment of domestic seafarers. And also we need to look at conditionality when it comes to making the sector greener. So it's not sufficient to consider that we will be stabilizing the number of vessels registered within EU or EEA member states. We also know that it's not sufficient nowadays to have vessels registered under EU flags to have the situation where it will automatically translate into more employment for domestic seafarers. It's not operating that way. There are many loopholes. We need to close those loopholes, and we need to find a way. And I would love to have this discussion also within the Sectoral Social Dialogue Committee with our counterpart, the EXA, in order to see what needs to be improved in the way those maritime subsidies are operating. They are certainly needed, and we need to keep them as much as possible, but we need to improve them.
One final question. We have a diverse group of people here, all of whom could be great experts on this, and they may know all of it, or some of it, or not so much. What are the subsidies that you say there are loopholes on? What are the key subsidies you're talking about?
We are talking about the tonnage tax, mainly. which is a form of corporate tax, a very favorable treatment that is being offered to some shipping companies. There are requirements, conditions attached to enjoying the granting of this tonnage tax. And then the other big categories is all the taxes for stimulating the employment of seafarers, domestic seafarers. So it's tax reliefs on tax on payroll, exemptions. This is what we are talking about concretely. And also social contribution, social protection contribution made by the employers, by the shipping companies, which are also in some schemes amongst the member states attached to the granting of exemptions. So those are the key taxes we are talking about.
Philippe, thank you very much. I think it's a kind of a rich introduction from your perspective of what's the question. Could I turn, Martin Dorsman, to you, the European Ship Owners Association, starting with the same first question, kind of looking back 10 years, looking forward 10 years, what's the story? Because as we speak about European workers, European shipbuilders, we have a regional location, but we're a part of a global dynamic. And so these two things have to coexist.
Exactly. Going back 10 years in time means a couple of months after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers bank. We all know what that led to, global financial crisis and economic crisis. And I think for most market segments in shipping, there's still not a recovery from that crisis. Also because there were a lot of ships on order, because the booming years up till 2008, end of 2008, ships were on order and they were finally delivered to the ship owners. So there's still a lot of overcapacity in the markets. The fall of the oil price, September 2014, leading to a major crisis in the offshore industry. A lot of offshore vessels still being laid up, so there's also not a real recovery there. So for most European ship owners, but also at global level, it's still very difficult times in an economic way. And if you look more specifically at Europe, we see growing competition from outside Europe. Of course, we all know the open registers that are there for a long time already, like Liberia and Panama, Marshall Islands. But especially Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, Vancouver, Shanghai are now also aiming to become a global hub for shipping. I think it's fair to say that at this point in time, Europe still has a very important maritime cluster. So ship owners, shipbuilding, seafarers, and I fully agree with Philippe. It's very important to have a substantial amount of European seafarers, because they are of key importance for the maritime cluster. And I think the challenge for us sitting here in this panel is to look for answers. How can we defend and also increase and strengthen the position of the maritime cluster in Europe? Because there are a lot of challenges. That brings me to the second point, looking back 10 years in time, environmental improvement. If I look at 2009, well, we just had the decision on reducing sulfur. But the whole discussion about CO2, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, started more or less at that time. And in April 2018, last year, IMO took the decision to reduce emissions by 50% 2050 compared to 2008. So there's a very big challenge, but I think that we as Europe can have answers to those challenges if we work together, if the shipbuilding and the equipment manufacturers do their job, and together with the ship owners, that we can meet the challenges. 5 years, looking 5 years in time, in 2023, IMO will make the final strategy on the greenhouse gas reductions. For now, it's an initial strategy. It says at least 50% 2050. Well, perhaps they will increase ambitions. And we also have to come forward the coming years with real reduction measures short term, because 2050 is a long way. But we as industry, we are serious. We are committed to reducing our emissions. We want to be part of the solution. So it's also up to the industry to show that we are serious and come forward with concrete measures to reduce emissions also the coming years up to 2023. I think these are the most important ones. Then the seafarers. Philippe already referred to the good social sector dialogue we have. We are discussing positive means to increase or at least stabilize the number of seafarers. But the challenge there, I think, is that the industry is a very diversified industry. And also the labor market in Europe is very diversified. The situation in the Netherlands is uncomparable to the situation in Germany. Situation in Italy is uncomparable to the situation in France. So there is no silver bullet to work on the position of EU seafarers. Sometimes I wish there was a silver bullet, because that would make our life much easier. But we really have to have the figures. That's why the project on the figures is so important. We have to have figures at national level. We are also looking at seafarers. European seafarers are relatively short at sea and then they go to shore. We have statistics, for example, for the Netherlands. They show that all the seafarers take up a position in the maritime cluster. That's very important. So, and that's also a thing that I want to do the next years. What can we learn from each other's best practices? The Netherlands, I was managing director of the Dutch Ship Owners Association, so I know a little bit about what the Netherlands did the last 10 years. There are good examples of what can be done. For example, to increase the number of youngsters going to maritime institutes. It can be done. But it's hard work. You have to start small and scale up fast if the project works. But there are good examples. And I think scaling up those examples to those countries where they might work, that's the way forward. But also in this respect, if we talk about seafarers, there are, of course, developments that influence the number of seafarers that are actually on a vessel. Digitalization, automation, so the size of the crew continually declines over years. Another point to mention, I think, is also that the maritime education, it's a technical education. It's quite a tough education, and there are a lot of land-based industries fighting for the same youngsters, not go to a nautical institute, but to a technical engineering institute. So the competition is also out there. And with the aging population in a lot of European countries, there's a real battle for the youngsters. So not saying that we should not do anything, but the challenge is there also very big. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, there's a kind of a very rich menu of possibilities there. You began in your retrospective comment to talk in particular about overcapacity. I know there are many different kinds of ships and so on, but in an order of magnitude, what is that? Where is the worst overcapacity, and how is it hurting in a practical business sense to do with business continuity and certainty?
Well, I already mentioned the offshore industry, and there's the overcapacity is huge, but also in other segments there are simply too many vessels for the cargo that's out there. And to give you an example of Dutch ship owner, I won't mention names, but they have the smaller vessels. The break even for such a vessel is $17,000 a day. That's what $11,000 a day. That's what a Dutch ship owner told me a couple of years ago. At that point of time, the ship was doing $5,000 a day, meaning $6,000 a day lost, being financed by the bank. If then the figures out there, there's a recovery of 20%, that means going up from $5,000 to $6,000 a day. Still a loss of $5,000 a day. So that's what we're talking about. That's what's happening in the markets.
Again, let me ask you the question. Typically in a sector that is overcapacity, you end up with people being squeezed out. Is that actually happening?
Well, if you look at...
are they hanging in, or are they about to fall out?
Well, it's a question, not only the ship owner has a problem, but also the bank has a problem. Because he still has a mortgage on the vessel. If he would pull the plug, what will the value of the vessel be, the scrap value, so also the bank will lose a certain amount of money.
But if there's overcapacity and you're anchored somewhere and doing nothing, there's a slight balance sheet illusion in the presumption that nothing is something.
Sorry,
there's a kind of an illusion having in a bank's balance sheet a ship that sits on anchor somewhere gently rusting in the breeze.
Yeah, but that's not happening.
It's not happening.
No, except for offshore. But a lot of merchant cargo vessels are still sailing and hoping for better times. Okay. And every year they expect the next year will be better.
Okay, so there's a kind of a controlled, I won't call it optimism, but hope that something will turn up.
Yeah, and what you see happening, I think that's relevant to notice if, for example, in certain countries, a lot of ownership being transferred with a haircut, so the new owner buying the vessel for a relatively cheap price, and ownership is also mostly outside Europe. So that's also something that's happening, and that's also, I think, a worrying development. But the ships still are there on the market, but now with less capital expenditure, so less cost for the new owner. So still...
You mentioned, and this is by no means, and we don't have to confine the observation to Europe, but you are the European Owners Association. You mentioned two big things, digital and greening. Is there a space for a European economy with all of those high-capacity skills to be able to get back into a leadership end of the shipping game through these evolutions in the digital or greening space?
Yes, I certainly think so. I already referred to the maritime cluster, that we, as a maritime cluster, in the shipbuilding, equipment manufacturers, we have the knowledge. And I think the challenge for us together is that we find the answers, that ship owners are really involved. We need support. I gave an explanation about the difficult financial situation for most ship owners, so we need support. That's what we are asking from the EU. If we talk about maritime subsidies, we need support. There is a quite intensive lobby campaign. It's called by the Waterborne Technology Platform, asking for enough financial means in the new long-term financial programs of the European Commission. So we need the support, but we are willing to do the work, and we are ready for the challenge, but we need support. Well,
again, interesting. I just want one final question for the moment. As you talk about needing support and to do these kind of, future-facing things, and Philippe was talking in a certain way about the same thing to do with seafarers and skills, are you singing from the same hymn sheet to do with conditioning the support to the greening or the digitalization or whatever, or just kind of leaving the support systems a bit like they are?
Well, there are different schemes in the market. There was a reference to tonnage tax. There was a reference to wage cost reduction schemes. I think it's very important to keep in mind that each instrument must have a very clear goal. If you link too many goals to one instrument, you achieve, in the end, actually nothing. Tonnage tax is all about giving European ship owners a level playing field with the non-EU competitors. That's what tonnage tax is about. Keeping European ship owners in Europe, meaning jobs. Tonnage tax is also about jobs. Jobs in the offices of the ship owners. High-skilled jobs, creating a lot of added value for the European economy. Because that was the lesson learned from the 70s, 80s. Ship owners were also leaving Europe, closing offices, not only flagging out, but also cutting down on their office employment. So tonnage tax is about global level playing field. It's about keeping ship owners in Europe. It's about jobs on shore. Then we have the schemes for the labor cost reductions of European seafarers. In my opinion, they are also very important. They are also effective, I think. But still, there is a challenge if you look at European seafarers. What I said, it differs between countries, so we have to find good answers to those challenges together with ETF.
Thank you very much. Again, there's a lot there. I might come back on that policy toolkit later to see how we would look at that. there's a nice segue from that, of course, then to Christoph Titgat, Secretary General of Sea Europe. So, Christoph, you're the one close to speaking for shipbuilders and the maritime industry. So we've kind of arrived at your spot through the labour force and through the ship owners. So again, looking back, looking forward, where are we going, or where might we go, depending on certain things?
Well, first looking back, where were we? In Europe, we were amongst the global leaders in the building of merchant ship types. We are talking about tankers, bulkers, container ships. On those segments, together with offshore, but that's, let's say, more linked to the oil crisis. On those 4 segments, we are no longer global leader in Europe. Even more, we are almost nowhere anymore in Europe, because everything left Europe for Asia. The reason was that Asia decided to make shipbuilding and, to a lesser extent, marine equipment a strategic sector, which unfortunately Europe has completely overlooked or forgotten about. To get, let's say, these segments in Asia, the Asian countries used a toolbox including state aid, massive state aid and the like, which contributed to the overcapacity that we today see in merchant shipbuilding, of which ship owners, including European ship owners, are, let's say, suffering from. But let's not forget that they also largely contributed to that situation themselves, because the ships were very cheap, and there was, of course, a tendency to buy 2 ships for the price of 1 in Europe. At the same time, in a European context, we managed to, or let's say the most innovative and creative shipyards in Europe managed to stay in business because they refocused themselves to what we call the complex shipbuilding. So we are then talking about very specific niche markets like cruise ships, like dredgers, research vessels, mega yachts, ferries, also naval ships. On those ship types, we are still a global leader in Europe. But because of the overcapacity in Asia, the Asians are now looking into gaining or conquering the market leadership that Europe has on complex shipbuilding for commercial or for geopolitical and geostrategic reasons, using again what I call the same toolbox. We have a certain degree of success already, because as we speak, we see the orders for new build ferries leaving massively Europe for China. We see LNG-fueled container ships going to South Korea, although the first LNG-fueled ship was a cruise ship built in Europe. And that is largely also with the contribution of European ship owners. Now, at the same time...
Meaning that in the competitive environment of the ship owners, in order to survive, they've got to find the best cost option, so they head for Asia to spend their money in Asia. Is that the point you're making?
Well, if they had to, that's a different thing. The opportunity was there. Of course, if you can buy a car for 50,000 or the same car for 100,000, inevitably you will buy it for 50,000, or you will buy 2 for the price of 1.
As I guess you would do with your own car if the option came.
Of course, I will go for 1 of 100,000. But
there are very few patriots like you around.
But the question is, how is that possible? And then, of course, I cannot blame them for doing that. The question is, why do they have that opportunity? And then we really come to the level playing field. Now, contrary to the European ship owners, who have indeed also, and who still suffer from competitive pressure from abroad, they have these maritime stated guidelines with tonnage tax and so on, which help them to regain competitiveness. Unfortunately, other segments of the maritime cluster in Europe, like shipbuilding, have the same global competitive pressure, are confronted with global distortions, and don't have any scheme at this point in time to regain their own global competitive position. And of course, a lot can be done in a European context, but ultimately, since we are talking about global competition, there needs to be a global solution. And then we are looking at, for instance, the WTO, which at this point in time does not have any rules that would help our industry to tackle the problems. And that's also something that we need to look at, and where we have something in common, I think, as well. From the equipment side, we are still a global leader in Europe for any type of systems, technologies, equipment, including advanced, let's say, high-tech products. But also there, partly due to the overcapacity in the shipyards in Asia, but we see that in Asia, but also abroad, or let's say in other places other than in Asia, we see a growing tendency for increased trade obstacles, so trade barriers, which also hamper on our position. And if you look at that, and then you look at Europe, we still have, I would say, largely this open market policy. And I think then we have to seriously reconsider in Europe our strategy vis-à-vis the rest of the world. And I think there we have to ask ourselves the question, are we going more and more to insist on reciprocity? Basically saying, if I can do business in your place, you can do business in my place. If you basically are creating obstacles to me, I will do it in yourself. I will do the same for your companies. It's not nice, but perhaps it is a way to get everybody around the table, because I think ultimately the type of phenomena that we see in the maritime industry globally are, I think, not tenable in the long term. And I think shipbuilding is in that respect a perfect example. We have seen, and I understand why Asian countries wanted to, let's say, improve their shipyards locally. They have done that, but it should not have been done to the detriment of, for instance, Europe. I think we have to come to a situation globally whereby everybody can kind of compete for the best, let's say, product, but at the end of the day, it cannot be that we are undercutting each other and ultimately contributing to situations whereby some forms of government policies ultimately undermine the own local industry. And that's what we have seen with the overcapacity and the collapse of the oil prices on the offshore market in some of the Asian countries, where then there is then a tendency basically to cure the disease by making it even worse, by increasing the disease. So basically subsidies creating to or leading to the overcapacity, and then to cure that, bringing in even more state aid. I think.
So Christophe, your best guess, looking into the crystal ball, 5 or 10 years forward, much change for the worse? What are you looking at as you look down that perspective?
What we are looking at is that, first of all, we want in Europe to maintain the global leadership position we have today. So that is definitely on complex shipbuilding and on marine equipment. We want Europe to rediscover the strategic dimension of maritime, including for shipbuilding and marine equipment, but also for shipping and the like. And Martin already hinted at it, and you asked the question to Martin. I think the greening and the digitalization topics are challenges, but are also opportunities. Indeed, we have asked the European Commission, in the context of its new R&D framework called Horizon Europe, to provide a bigger envelope to help the industry to do its investments, because if we want to do it properly, it will require a lot of investments. But I think that if we do it in the right way, in a European context, and there is definitely a willingness in the maritime cluster in Europe to be ahead and to be leader on these greening and digitalization topics, we can still do a good business in the coming years. But that, of course, requires the support also from the European institutions, including European Commission, and for that, as I mentioned earlier on, they have to rediscover that our sector matters.
So are you telling me they're listening with a deaf ear so far?
I will answer your question with a good example. We have, under the current R&D framework called Horizon 2020, we have a financial envelope for technology platforms to implement their R&D agenda. Within the modes of transport, waterborne, maritime and inland have been the only ones not receiving a financial envelope to implement its R&D agenda. I think that answers your question.
It sure does, yeah. Good. Ship owners, hand up.
Yeah, perhaps two remarks, short ones, about South Korea. EXA, together with Sea Europe, is also addressing the topic of South Korea supporting its shipbuilding industry, but also having cargo reservation schemes in the support program, meaning that cargo for South Korea can only be transported by South Korean flagged vessels. And that's, of course, a huge concern for ship owners. So we, as ship owners, are also recognizing that to have cheap vessels on the market, not solving the overcapacity we see is not a good thing. So we are really united there. And we issue the same press release. The Japanese government is really active, and we talk to the Japanese government here in Brussels and discuss ways how we can bring this topic forward. The other remark about your last question, does the European Commission recognize the strategic assets of ship owners and shipbuilding? If you look back at the financial programs, you can say, well, we don't see anything there. So, but we see it changing, and not only for ship owners and shipbuilding, but in March this year, the European Commission published a document about the relationship between the EU and China. And in it, there are 10 commandments about how to deal with the challenges EU is posing to, or the China is posing to the EU. So you really see a difference, a shift in thinking in Europe about what China is doing, the geopolitical agenda, and the possible consequences for Europe. And finding an answer to that is, of course, very difficult for Europe, given the fact that Europe is not really united on important policy topics, and also, of course, the economic ties between Europe and China are already so big. So any change in stance might have consequences for that. But I think I said it. I start saying it. I think 5 or 10 years ago that Europe was too naive about China, and we now see it changing, and that's, I think, is a good thing.
Okay, I'm going to take a break here on the kind of Euro introspection, although very much in a very global context, as you've all described it, and invite our fourth panellist, Catherine Bamford, from Port of Vancouver. And Catherine, kind of connecting up a little bit, because that last observation kind of brings me nicely to a question, at least to begin with yourself. You've a port that has undergone strategic development and has future plans. So again, we'll look back a bit and look forward a bit, if you don't mind, to tell us where you've been, where you're going, and how you get there, who invests. So one of these investment questions, is it someone from the outside or someone from the inside does that kind of thing? And I don't know for Canada, so you might pick up on that question as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the perspectives. I think there's actually a lot of segue here. So when you said, looking back 10 years, the first thing I thought of was volume. So in Vancouver, being Canada's largest port by some spectacular margin, I think we handle more cargo than the next 5 or 6 ports combined in Canada. Looking back 10 years ago, China was emerging as sort of our number 3 trading partner, and has been number 1 for about 10 years, overtaking Japan and South Korea. And by overtaking, I mean spectacularly racing past. So if we look at volume, the volume in Vancouver has increased substantially, but China has been the major player there, both import and export. I believe China is, for Vancouver, about 1/3 of our total volume of 148 million tons per year. So a substantial player in and out. So the emergence of China, and not the emergence necessarily of Asia, but the emergence of China, has shifted considerably the trade dynamics. And you can hear that from every single one of my colleagues, and shifted it to the Pacific sort of theater, I suppose, if you want to use that term. So size and scale also, if we're thinking about vessels. From a port's perspective, it doesn't matter what sector you're talking about. We have 5 separate business sectors. All of the Asian-built automobiles that are sold in Canada come through Vancouver. All of the, the majority of Western Canada's raw resources. I mean, I used to have a vice president who would say, we dig up our country and we send it overseas. That's how we become prosperous in Canada. All of those vessels are upsizing. The size of container vessels it has in the last 10 years astronomically changed the dynamics of ports. How you deal with the size of vessels, the scale, the exchange, the amount of containers that you would exchange in one exchange 10 years ago versus today. We have vessels that overtake the size of buildings in some cases. The size of cruise vessels. If you think about that, Vancouver handled, what we would handle a vessel of 1,500 passengers was something that we would handle 10 years ago. Now we're handling vessels that are cruise ships that are handling, hold 4,000 passengers. You've got 2,000 people on board who are taking care of those people. So you're moving cities around the ocean. What does that do to your infrastructure? Are you having to raise a bridge? How do you build a new terminal? How long now does that take? So those types of changes have been dynamic and astronomical in the last 10 years. Which leads me sort of to my next point would be the need for collaboration, the need for more collaboration, and the need for even more collaboration. I cannot overstate it. It's astronomical how much the dynamic has shifted in the last 10 years, particularly in Canada, with a focus on engagement, with a focus on First Nations rights, traditional territories, communities. I mean, Vancouver, the Port of Vancouver uniquely has facilities operating in 16 separate municipalities. So that's 16 mayors and 16 councils. That's just one layer. We do report federally. That gives us a long-term view, so we're able to build infrastructure. But that is a complex environment. We had elections in November, I believe, and 8 of the mayors changed. So now you have a different dynamic that you're working with. So that complexity, that regulatory environment, that meeting the needs and the requirements and the expectations of the communities in which you host facilities, very complex. That's definitely changed in the last 10 years and will only become more important and more complex. I would say the other one that is really important for us is the emergence of data for evidence-based decisions. 10 years ago, I would say we were starting to emerge in digital understanding. The sophistication of data collection and the importance of understanding and interpreting that data to make solid evidence-based decisions, it's just a given now. We are, and I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow on a roundtable, where we make decisions based on data, which means that you have to have the systems and the ability to collect it, let alone interpret it and use it for decisions. We say that visibility is what we see and transparency is what we share. Transparency is so important, and you have to start with the ability to collect the data in order to share it, to make better decisions. So the sophistication, I think, in the world of operating ports, in the complex environment of collaboration, has absolutely changed the game in the last 10 years. Those ports that are able to have open dialogue and be transparent and respectful and earn the trust of communities, they have the competitive advantage in a complex trading environment.
So, I mean, one very big observation, you repeated the collaboration word. is the complexity of managing the ecosystem, including all the elements, the municipalities you mentioned, and the other dimensions that come. To do with funding this, is it self-funding? Is it a vast port? Is it just kind of funding itself off its own capacity? Does it turn to the federal government? Is China coming like they came to Greece and putting money into the port? Where does all this come from? Or is it a diverse mixture of funding sources?
So let's knock the last one off first. Yeah, okay. That's not going to happen. The port system in Canada is essentially an arm of government. Okay. We're at arm's length, but we operate reporting directly to the federal government. We have one shareholder, and it is Canada. So there is no opportunity to invest into the Port Authority. There is opportunity to invest into terminals, and we can talk about that. But the port itself, the Port Authority, is required by law to be financially self-sufficient. So for us, we generate revenue. We're a landlord port. We generate revenue through rent and through fees. And so you could say legitimately that customers are what's keeping the port running. They pay our salaries, and we must use their funds mindfully. We have a vision to be the world's most sustainable port, and for us, we define that very specifically as healthy environments, thriving communities, and prosperity through trade. So we are bound, we have a mandate to look at decisions through those three lenses, which creates inevitable but healthy tension. And so, when we think about how we're funded, we spend that money. All of that money goes into building the gateway, which means facilities. It means terminal facilities, but uniquely, and I think this is unique certainly for Canada. When I travel around the world, I don't hear of any other port that's doing what we're doing in Canada, or port system that's doing what we are doing in Canada, where the federal government has, it's their job to build infrastructure. They fund infrastructure. That's what they do. They fund infrastructure. What they've done in Canada for the past 10 years, which has had a positive effect on all three of those pillars of our vision, is they put huge funds together, and for merit-based application, it must be merit-based. They have specific criteria, and for us, we must meet criteria in each of those three pillars in order for infrastructure to be built. They match funds. So if you're able to put a project forward, they match the funds, and then you build. So they're infusing the transportation trade-enabling lands with transportation infrastructure to be able to move goods and people much more quickly, efficiently. What that does is it helps communities. It takes traffic off roads. It reduces emissions. It keeps everything moving. And from an environmental perspective, we must do it by mitigating any environmental damage. So when you look at the ability of Canada to actually move goods, it has the full support of the Canadian government, because we're a trading nation and we have our priorities in order. And the port system is really the arm to enable that.
You were very quick to take the last option off the table. Is the issue of financing one's own ports in Canada a federal government policy, and they simply don't want foreign money coming in? Is that a federal policy, or is it just the way it has happened so far?
The port authorities are, as I said, sort of arm's length, but we're essentially an arm of government. So that's off the table from an investment perspective. Foreign investment in the port system in Canada can happen at the terminal operator level from a concessionaire perspective. I mean, we have a current situation with Dubai Ports World that operates a terminal in Vancouver, a substantial terminal. They're going through a big upgrade at the moment. They're adding about 15% to the footprint of their terminal, which it'll take the terminal from around 900,000 TEU to about 1.5 million TEU. As part of that program, they have to go through the Port Authority's permitting process. We're also a regulator. So that permitting process is incredibly robust, very comprehensive technical studies that have to be done. You must consult with First Nations. You must consult with communities. It's a requirement. You must mitigate any environmental damage. So back to those 3 pillars of our vision, all of our programs are set up that way as well. So from a foreign investment perspective, foreign investment or not, if you are able to meet the requirements, then that is something that we'll look at. Canada as a nation has an Investment Canada Act, a piece of law that very specifically details thresholds and requirements for foreign investment in Canadian institutions for non-Canadians. So we have law in place, we have processes in place, there are many checks and balances, and there are all kinds of criteria for investors, foreign or not.
Look, that is really interesting. I'm going to come back around the panel if I could from the back.
I'm seeing heads nodding,
which is really interesting. I know I started with all of you as it were in your own pillar, but I mean you're in this cluster together for better and worse. Yeah. And just picking up on that theme, I had the privilege yesterday afternoon to do the opening ceremony, which is a very interesting mix on our panel. And one of our panelists, of course, was Xiaopeng Li, the Transport Minister of the People's Republic of China. And when he was speaking about the Belt and Road Initiative, he was talking about, you know, the harmonies and the win-wins and so on. I'm just interested to know, because you've talked about all these rules about, you know, bundling things up, that, you know, South Korean traffic has to go on a South Korean ship, or level playing fields, or the absence of them, and state subsidies in one place or their absence somewhere else. We have seen in European ports, you've talked about the extraordinary growth in the trade volumes and the dominance of one state in particular to do with its growth. We've seen in European ports, maybe 10 years back if I go back and look, I don't think any container traffic was owned by, in a European port, a Chinese company, and today it's about 10% of EU container traffic and rising. So where are you guys on all of that? I'm going to come back to you, Philippe, just around hopes, around anxieties, around issues that arise that you think need to be picked up.
Thank you for raising this question. Actually, there are some both hopes and reasons for concerns. I will start saying that actually, as a federation bringing also unions representing port workers across Europe, we have no fundamental opposition against foreign investment. It all depends how those investments are dealt with. I would like to say that actually, as long as those foreign investments are made in such a way that they are compliant with the national legislation in the member states and the social legislation in particular, I would say there is not much reasons for concerns. But let me point out at the fact that these foreign investments are not coming in a normal business, I would say, situation. They are coming at a time where overcapacity in port operations is already taking place. So my fear is that it might reinforce further the overcapacity in European ports, with all the detrimental effects and consequences this might have, in particular for port workers. Pressure on downward pressure on port prices, more competition between European ports, and they are already competing quite a lot already. So the overcapacity in port operations in cargo handling might be really a problem. And what I'd like to say is that actually it would be great if in Europe we would start thinking all together how to handle those foreign investment. I'm saying that those investments are doing on a case-by-case basis without the European Union and the stakeholders having a say or having a clear stand. We need to connect this with our own policy on infrastructure, on the corridors. You are best placed as coordinator in Europe to know that if we need to improve, if we want to improve connectivity, then the same should apply also with the foreign investment. They need to be connected also with our own strategy. Otherwise, we may be confronted with a lack of solidarity between the member states, some opportunistic approaches from some governments. So that would be my answers in terms of fears and opportunities.
Thank you very much. Christophe, can I again just ask you the same question on that investment piece?
I am tempted to be negative in the sense that it's not a coincidence that the figure you mentioned shows an increase of Chinese influence. And I'm quite pessimistic in the sense that we have, at this point in time in Europe, a situation whereby, frankly speaking, we don't have such a strong Commission because they are, or they have been confronted with the migration issue, with Brexit and so on. We have member states who try to do what they think is needed for the country. And if that means doing business with China, they will certainly do it. So the European reflex is, I think, lacking. I think we have also been, for much too long, too naive with China, in the sense that most of us only saw China as a country of opportunities, which it is, but it's not just a country of opportunities, it's also a country that poses challenges. Because one thing which I personally admire with the Chinese, they have one thing that we don't have in Europe, and that is a vision, a strategy. Now we can debate what is the context or the reasons for that, whether it's, let's say, the advantage of being a democracy or not. But the point is they have a strategy, and that strategy is very thorough, and you see it in very different segments. For shipping, it is Belt and Road. For shipping and ports, it is Belt and Road. For our sector, shipbuilding and marine equipment, it is the Made in China 2025. Because our sector is, together with 9 other sectors, identified as key strategic sectors where China wants to take over the leadership. They have a vision. It is supported. It's determined by the government. It is supported by the government. And it's very difficult to do something about that. At the same time, there are some signs of what I call slight positivism. That is that recently, the EU has adopted a so-called foreign direct investment screening legislation, whereby foreign direct investments in strategic sectors may be looked at carefully, and it's providing a framework for all the member states, and not just for some, to have a framework, to have tools to kind of stop these type of investments if they think it should be stopped. And at the same time, as Martin said earlier on, there is now this communication on China with 10 action points, whereby for the very first time, I must say I was quite surprised, the terminology used in that communication is quite tough, which a year and a half, 2 years ago would have been unthinkable. But at the same time, we should not be blind for the reality. If you go to the port of Piraeus, there I think you see Chinese politics in real life. If you go to Rotterdam, to Antwerp or the likes, you have a mixture of containers on board of a mixture of container ships. If you go to Piraeus, you see one thing, COSCO containers on board of COSCO ships. And I think this is the thing we are facing. I hope we are not too late, but it's very obvious that the Chinese are determined for very good reasons that belong to them. And I think the European Union and the member states should think twice. Unfortunately, I think at this point in time, we are not yet there. And if you see the exit polls of the next European Parliament elections, I think we may even be further down the road than we are today.
Thank you. Martin, I need a stiff drink after this session.
Yeah. Oh, okay. If I'm going to add something to what Christophe had said, then, well, no, I think Christophe more or less said it all. It's, well, at this point in time, of course, it's also for the industry associations to lobby the new Commission, to lobby the new European Parliament, to come forward with proposals for the vision we think that Europe should have. And so there's a responsibility also for us, of course. And talking about a vision, strategic vision, fully agree. And for example, part of the strategic vision of China is also that COSCO should become #1 worldwide, taking over the place of Maersk. So it all fits in the bigger picture of what China is doing. And the last remark about foreign investments and competition, we are not, of course, challenging competition or foreign investments, and they can have very big contributions to local economy, regional economy, economy of a country. So we are not opposing that. It's all about conditions.
Thank you. I'm going to check. I don't know if anyone in the audience would like to intervene with a comment or a question. Can you just raise your hand if you would like to do that? Yes. Can we get the microphone? I just think it's useful to open the conversation. We've had a very rich palette presented to us here. Please, sir, can you tell who you are, what you represent, or who you represent?
Yes, certainly. Hi, my name is Elio Vicente, International Chamber of Shipping. Very interesting discussion, and I think a lot was said about overcapacity, and I certainly agree and subscribe to that. My question is, I guess, specifically to Christophe and maybe to Martin as well. The idea from an overcapacity perspective is, if I got your messaging correct, is to get a sort of multilateral agreement in place. Ideally, that would be through the WTO. I think we all know that. Or there is also the OECD shipbuilding subsidy, shipbuilding discussions stream of it. I was wondering if you could sit down with the two heads of WTO and OECD, what would the message be in terms of this is what we would like to see happen? Bearing in mind that with the OECD, there's the additional challenge of having China not being a member, although they're a key player in the shipbuilding perspective, they're not an official member of OECD, which in itself creates some challenges. So I was quite interested in your take on that. And I've got a question for Catherine as well, if that's okay. Catherine, I was recently following this news about this Bill C-48. I assume you're probably familiar with it. That basically it's intended to ban the anchorage of oil tankers within a specific area of British Columbia, I believe including parts of Vancouver, which has been fairly controversial in Canada. And I wonder if you'd be able to give us a little bit of an overview of the implications of this bill if it were to come to fruition, and what the intent of the government actually was in trying to pass this through. Thanks.
Alex, great questions, and thank you very much. So let me start with Christophe and Martin, and then Catherine, you can pick up the British Columbia question. Christophe.
Thank you, and many thanks for the question, which is spot on and basically very timely. I think we have come to a situation whereby we need to consider carefully how to move forward. Our industry is inherently cyclical, and like in many other industries, it's run by human beings. And perhaps I will say something controversial, but I think our industry may be may have a reflex of sometimes having a bit of a childish behavior, in the sense that ship owners amongst themselves sometimes have a tendency to go even further than the direct competitor. A bit like children with, I have 2 toys, oh, I have 4. So I ordered 2 ships, oh, I ordered 4 and mine are bigger. And of course, on the other hand, from the side of the yards, you have something like, oh, we are there to produce it. So I think there is a need to discipline ourselves for the sake of ourselves. Now, where to do it, it should be done in an international level. Ideally, that should be the WTO. There you have all the players around the table. As we speak, there are discussions going on trying to reform the WTO, with including an attempt to address the gaps that are existing for industry at this point in time. One thing which is not under discussion at this point in time in a WTO context is the concept of pricing disciplines. Now, the other avenue is the OECD. There has been an attempt to revive discussions that failed already twice in the past, whereby, you're right, China is not part of the OECD, but there was an invitation to China to join the debate, so to join the discussions that are taking place in an OECD context. Unfortunately, China at this point in time does not seem to be ready to step into that debate again, because they have asked the questions, what is the guarantee that this time, the 3rd time, will be more successful in reaching an ultimate outcome compared to the 2 previous times? And very often it boils down to the same problem, are we also going for pricing disciplines or not? We from the European side, we are firm believers that there should be pricing discipline. I'm not talking about a communist type of approach, but there needs to be a certain discipline. It is not tenable and not sustainable to have systematically situations whereby your direct competitor is basically selling ships below cost production, under the price, so to say. So from our perspective, there is definitely a need to reach an agreement at global level to the interest of everybody. In which form it will be ultimately found, it remains to be seen. Only time will tell.
Thank you. Martin, are you the bold boy who wants 2 sweets instead of 1?
When Christoph made a remark about childish behavior, I thought of a saying, the only difference between men and boys is the size of the toys. But yeah, I think I can agree to a big extent what Christoph is saying, and of course, producing and then selling vessels below the cost of production, it's from a macroeconomic point of view, it's not a good thing. And that individual ship owners see the opportunity and make use of the opportunity, that I also understand. But I think you have, if you talk about this topic, you also have to look at more the macroeconomic level. Thank you.
Catherine, the very particular question about tankers anchoring in British Columbia.
So I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to take the feedback that even in Europe this is being followed. So first of all, thank you for the question. Second, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Canadian government as to the intention of the legislation, but it's my understanding that it is really based around environmental concerns for running large tankers on the north coast. Which is a bit of a wild and the government considers to be quite a pristine area. I would say that where I would offer some thoughts is along the lines of policy alignment. So if, for instance, we have a government that is very focused on international trade, and it's the structure of the Port Authority system in Canada to enable that and to advance our international trade agenda, then it would be the position of the Port Authority that policy would support that, that intention and that requirement and that mandate. So if you look at it from that perspective, if we have, for instance, a government that is very focused on trade diversification and promoting exports abroad, we have for instance, we have a trade diversification minister of trade diversification. So it's a very important focus for us. If we put positions and policies in place such as national trade corridor investment funds where port authorities can and entities can apply for funding for transportation infrastructure to enable Canada's international trade agenda, then it would be logical to assume that any policy that the government would put in place should be supportive of the international trade agenda. There is some question in some discussions whether or not Bill C-48 is actually supportive of that Canadian international trade agenda. As far as tankers in Vancouver, we were talking a little earlier about the type of trade that's handled in Vancouver. It's extremely diverse. We have the most diversified port trade in North America. If you can think about it, we probably handle it. We do handle crude oil in Vancouver. We handle somewhere between 30 and 50 tankers a year. There is a project that is underway and is under consideration and was challenged, and so it's going through further review to increase the amount of oil handled through Vancouver, which would arrive by pipeline, which of course is not our jurisdiction, but the movement of vessels would be our jurisdiction. I don't believe that's covered by Bill C-48. That's a separate jurisdiction location. But that project is another example of where Canada's international trade agenda and the government wanting to promote that butts up against, community interest and environmental mitigation. So not without sort of tension in that particular sector in a couple of different places on the west coast of Canada. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. No, there's some wonderful subtlety. You're great at dancing on eggshells to do with the first part of the answer. Most interesting, and thank you. Were there any? Thank you, Alex, for those questions. Did any other hands go up? Because I was attentive in Alex's direction. Yes, please. Yeah. Again, please introduce yourself and your organisation.
Okay, Rosie Chang from WTO. I really cannot resist. You mentioned WTO. Well, it's very frustrating talking about maritime transport. Last time discussion in WTO, that was 2004. And since then, there was no sort of discussion on maritime transport, never on the agenda of all our meetings. I think we also have, of course, Doha, failure of Doha round, of course, is a major reason, but also I haven't seen, really business support for that, maritime discussion in the WTO, even the demanders like EU. So I don't know whether you want to do something recently or, and also another question is that because we have a very fragmented legal system in the WTO. So for example, maritime shipping that is within the framework of, we call it the GATS, General Agreement for Trading Services. But the problems you mentioned, shipbuilding, that is sort of governed by another agreement about, subsidy, countervailing. And then but the issues, they are interlinked. And then but then when they discuss subsidies, okay, in the other committee, but that will not really pass on the message to people working in shipping or in services. So I don't know whether you have some, as business, you have some coordinated efforts to address that issue.
That's a really interesting intervention. So aren't we lucky that someone from the WTO was sitting listening to this? So is there, to have an impact, you need to coordinate. To coordinate, you need to coordinate with the right people and collaborate with the right people. If it isn't happening, why isn't it happening, or how might it happen, I guess is the question. Because I won't say you're saying you're pushing on an open door, but you're saying there's not too many guys pushing at the door at the moment, if I've understood your intervention. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I cannot speak for the past. I only took this position in 2016, so I can only speak for as from 2016 onwards. What I can say is that on the shipbuilding part, we are, as an organization, in very close dialogue with the European Commission in order to bring the message to the WTO for the discussions that are taking place at this point in time. As we are also very active on the parallel avenue, which is the OECD, because we want, in one way or another, we want a solution. In terms of one speaking to the other, it's funny to hear that also you have the same problem that we see everywhere at national level, or even at the Commission. One doesn't speak to the other, although there are linkages. And partly this is also, I think, partly the responsibility of the industry itself. The advantage I think that we have today is that before I joined Sea Europe, I spent 15 years with the European ship owners. So we work together in another life. And
so we can blame you for the 2-for-1 policy before 2016.
Yeah, but this was not my file. I will then give So I think now there is a growing awareness that the industry should stop to continue to work in silos. For a number of reasons, which have to do with global challenges, but also challenges that we have in common, like the greening of shipping and so on. So I hope that, you know, the scenario that you were presenting will change in future. And at least on that point, I'm more positive than I was on other occasions today.
Philippe, do you want to pick up any of these observations from your point of view? No. Martin? No, and Catherine, you're not specifically on the WTO space, but I mean, yes, please. Can we get something up here to Mark? Yeah, it's on the way.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have a question for Christoph. Of course, you talked about the multilateral solutions. Of course, if you look at some of the maritime subsidies in other countries than Europe, it seems that there is a clear link sometimes between subsidies to shipping and shipbuilding. So that some of the, let's say, the subsidies are given to ship owners under the condition they spend it to also buying ships from the same country. Is that something that, so a kind of a local content requirement, is that something that you could also envisage in Europe? Is that something you would be in favor of?
Great. I think that I will answer with yes, but. Definitely this could help us, but I think that the reality is the following. I think we have to make a distinction between transatlantic or deep sea shipping and short sea shipping and cabotage. I don't think, although I may wish this, but I don't think that making subsidies for European ship owners conditional when they are trading in deep sea waters will really work. On the other hand, in a short sea context and a cabotage context, I think there we haven't seen this. And I think to an extent this is also the message from Philippe for his membership. I think there we definitely, as Europe, have to reconsider the framework in which we are working in. So yes, for I call it more the local, the short sea shipping. For the deep sea, I think it will be more difficult.
Let me, because I'm conscious I'm hearing all those bells ringing, which I think the next sessions are starting. If someone should leave, please do. But I just put one final question, if I could, and I'm going to put it to everyone. And it is deliberately provocative. But if I'm looking at all of the climate science, And if I'm looking at stuff endlessly going around the globe by air, by sea, by road, etc., I'm actually wondering whether the conversations we're having, which are very business as usual conversations, don't need some very fundamental reappraisal. I'm listening here in the few days to the most staggering growth prospects for air industry and shipping and container and trade. And this is good to do with prosperity, so I'm not naive, I can see this bit. And the other side, a lot of it looks like it's, I exaggerate, but potentially suicidal to do with some of the climate extinction and other issues. So I'm just wondering, do these things come up on the radar screen in a context where you're looking down the line? So you're looking at plus 10, plus 20, plus 30 years. Is it going to be more of the same? Or is it going to be pretty different? Christoph, you want to pick that up?
I don't think it will be more of the same on the, call it the societal challenges aspect. I hope it will also change on the operational / economic part, where you still see a lot of subsidies where to pick the, let's say, the bits and pieces from the others. But on the environmental, on the climate change debate, I think there is definitely, there is now IMO, which has taken a decision. We will see whether IMO will deliver fast enough. If it's not delivering fast enough, no doubt the EU will do its bit. But the bottom line, I think, is that the shipping industry, I can only speak for the shipping industry, will definitely have to do something. And you see in the ship owners community, there is a growing awareness that they have to move forward. So you see already, or we see already, a number of front runners. We from our side as shipbuilding and marine equipment manufacturers, together with the other colleagues in what is called the waterborne technology platform, we have recently adopted a strategic research agenda, which on the greening agenda clearly says that by 2030, we want to build zero emission new ships, and so for short sea shipping and for barges. And zero emission means really going beyond climate change alone. So it's also on the water noise.
I saw, sorry to interrupt you, I saw that the Chief Operations Officer of Maersk a few weeks back made a statement that even Maersk, which is kind of out in the great ocean, wants by 2030 no supplier to knock on the door if he's not coming with a zero, net zero carbon ship.
And so by 2050, we want, as a European waterborne community, we want to build or to have any ship on any trade to be zero emission. You mentioned the example of Maersk. Of course, Maersk is a very big company. For them, the investments will be huge, but perhaps more bearable than for the, I would say, the typical SME ship operator that we also have in European context. What is, I think, very important is that there we can continue on the research, development, and innovation side, and also, importantly, and there, to an extent, we come back a bit to the subsidies, that is that those who want to be amongst the front runners are also incentivized and have a legal certainty. Because what I've seen on the sulfur discussion, for instance, is that those who were amongst the front runners and, for instance, opted for open loop scrubbers now see themselves confronted with a new situation that the technology they have invested in was perhaps not the right one because it's in contradiction with other legislation and so on. But I think it's on the environmental side, it will definitely not be business as usual anymore.
Martin.
Well, I think the audience can hear that Christoph has a long working experience at the European Ship Owners Association, so I can more fully subscribe what he say. Just to stress that the decision by IMO in April 2018 is a historical one, to have a reduction goal of -50%. And that sets for the ship owners the point on the horizon. We have to work towards that. And if you look at the total global fleet and take into account that vessels will be out there for 20, 30 years or even longer, that means that new builds from 2030 more or less have to be zero emission. So it's very quick. And if I look at the shipping industry and if I compare the position of the shipping industry with that of 10 years ago, then I see a very fundamental mental, I would say it's a change in attitude. It's what I said in the beginning, we want to be part of the solution, and that's a fundamental change. And the minus 50% is also a goal on a pathway to full decarbonization. So that's the ultimate goal. And if I compare shipping, for example, with aviation, the older global transport industry, they are not there yet. So I think shipping is in the lead. We set a very ambitious goal. We as a ship owning industry, we go for it. And at the European level, we are now really teaming up with Sea Europe to make it happen and to contribute, to seize the opportunities and to contribute to European economic growth and jobs. That's the benefit for Europe as society.
Catherine, your response. Same question.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack, but I'm going to use an example as well. I think there's three things. Is it going to be business as usual? It's not business as usual. It's not going to ever go back to something, and I think it shouldn't. I would say three things. We need to, as an industry, look beyond our own jurisdictions, our own responsibilities. This is where ultra collaboration is the key to future success. We need to step outside of what would only be good for us and see what would be good for the majority or more. I'd like to go back to the idea of evidence-based decisions. The Port Authority has stepped outside of its role of traditional, regulating vessels in the harbor and dealing with safety and efficiency. It's fantastic. It's table stakes. We've gone well beyond that. We're building off-terminal transportation infrastructure. We're also doing things that you wouldn't expect from a Port Authority. For instance, we have a program that we started working on 5 years ago to take a look at the impact of noise on at-risk whale species. Okay, not usually your world of port authorities. So in the last 5 years, through collaboration and working with a whole pile of different entities, we have had now, this will be the third year, where we have taken hydrophone profiles, being able to use that evidence to implement vessel slowdown trials, changed the speed over successive months to determine, or in 2 programs in 2 years, to determine what effect that has on these at-risk species, and be able to step in well beyond or well ahead of regulation. Step in ahead of regulation. Go outside your silo, step in ahead of regulation, and see if we can solve these things in a unique and different way. The evidence that we're receiving back from these hydrophones demonstrates that maybe instead of having a ban in a certain area, or a lateral displacement, or you just can't run beyond a certain level of speed, we can actually determine when the whales are there. If they're only there 7 or 8 days out of a month, why would we slow you down for a whole month? So those types of looking at being able to do what you need to do, but in a way that works for the majority of people invested in the solution, I think is the way we have to move forward as an industry.
Thank you. We started with you, Philippe, so we will close with you.
Thank you. Well, I like very much the idea that was presented by Catherine to things beyond our own jurisdictions. As someone who is coming from a European Transport Workers Federation, which brings together all transport modes, we also need to think in terms of connectivity, of modal shifts, of equipping the transport workers of the future with the right skills and competences to handle the changes ahead. There will be huge differences in the years to come. The work is very much likely to change. We have been embarking in a very interesting project together with the EXA, which is named the Skill C project, which is all about designing the future curricula of seafarers and maritime professionals, because we know that the progress of digitalization, automation, and the higher requirements in terms of environmental requirements course, will mean totally different work, jobs in the future. So we are ready to look at those challenges in the future. And I would say that digitalization, automation will not necessarily be synonymous with losing jobs. It's going to be not done overnight in any case, and it will certainly mean different jobs. And we are prepared as social partners in Europe to look at those challenges together.
So this is not to wrap up, but one observation I would make. I mean, I'm here moderating. One of the things I do, which is also a part-time thing, it's not an executive role, is to coordinate one of the European transport corridors. And we have 11 coordinators. We are policy takers, we're not policy makers, but we are listened to because we are working with the system and through the system. I would make an offer to the three of you, or anyone else that's relevant in this cluster, for you to get your heads together to do something in the fall of this year where you would all meet all the coordinators, or in fact, most of them. One of them deals with railway traffic management, which is not your maritime priority, but that you would come with something which is short, visionary, coherent in its asks. If you ask too much, you frighten the horses and the coordinators, and it's very hard to advance it. But if you focus what you're looking for, and I've listened to the things about the WTO, etc., the asks they're well above my pay grade, so that's not the point I'm making to you. But I think we could have an interesting conversation. And I think what it does require is coherence, focus, and some priorities. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, as you well know. But I think to do with moderating panels here, I mean, thank all of you who stayed. We've had a small and intimate audience, but a very good discussion. Thank you for being here. To those who made interventions from the floor, thank you. And to our four wonderful panelists, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to work with you. So that's it. Thank you very much indeed.